Hello, Amanda.
Hi. Well, I guess we should introduce ourselves. I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm the executive editor at Pandagon.net, and I blog for RH Reality Check and for Slate's Double X.
And I'm Michael Dougherty. I'm a contributing editor at The American Conservative, and I blog on my own personal site. The blog is called The Unreal. And we're here recording Blogging Heads on Memorial Day and talking about religion, sex, power, all the good stuff. And I guess the first thing I wanted to talk about was you had a piece in The Revealer, which I thought was really interesting last week, where you talked about how the Catholic Church needs feminism. And I was hoping you could explain that a little bit for the viewers who maybe didn't catch the piece.
Well, The Revealer asked me to write about the recent John Jay College I guess they weren't sponsored. The researchers worked for the college, but it was mainly sponsored by a bunch of Catholic organizations with a little bit of money from the Department of Justice. It was a 5-year study that looked into the causes of the priest sex abuse scandals, predominantly in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and kind of early 80s. The report basically was an abject failure.
I agree. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, it had no impact whatsoever on the debate. So part of my piece was talking about how it had no impact whatsoever on the debate. The other part was my criticisms of the report and the church. I said that the Catholic Church has kind of failed in a way that a lot of Protestant denominations have not, in order to kind of retain its reputation and keep, existing believers from going out the door, especially in the wake of the sex abuse scandal. And the way I put it was they have no feminism, like no love of feminism. And the way I see it is, I'm a feminist atheist. I don't think there is such thing as a feminist religion, really. But right, that's okay. Personal for me. I do think that feminist critiques have been incorporated into many religious faiths, and it's been to their benefit. And I said that I feel like if the Catholic Church just gave a little on any single issue that perplexes their believers right now, they would get so much credit, and they would everyone would just act so relieved and grateful. I suggested that they could let women be priests, they could revoke the celibacy requirement for priests, they could, the biggest thing they could do, in my opinion, is get rid of the injunction against contraception. Any one of those, I think, would go a long way to getting back a lot of people that have left the faith because they just feel it doesn't speak to them anymore.
Right. I don't want to take those one by one, but I'm curious. I think some people would wonder how feminism or those changes would affect the sexual abuse of minors, particularly boys.
I don't think it would at all, and I said that in the piece. I said that, like, a lot. Basically, my first part was I think that the report didn't do anything to address sexual abuse. And there continued to be more cases, and they just sort of avoided talking about that. But what I think has happened is that a lot of people, like, were on their last leg with the Catholic Church, and the sex abuse scandal kind of drove them off. And if the Catholic Church wants to bring people back, like, they could give a little on one of these issues. I think that the sex abuse thing is not something you can address with one fell swoop.
Right. I thought the report was really disappointing, too, because as you pointed out, and I thought you satirized it very effectively, that it seemed to say that it's the hippies' fault, the 60s happened, and there was all this flower power, and the church suddenly was overcome with lust for young boys, which makes no logical sense. And it doesn't deal with, I think, where I'd agree a lot of times with a more liberal critique of the church that I'm a member of, is there is a clerical culture. There is a culture of self-protection in the among priests, bishops, and cardinals in the Catholic Church. That's really terrifying. Actually, there was a story just this past week that a priest from the diocese of a bishop who's advising Pope Benedict on coming up with a new set of policies for dealing with sex abuse, a priest in his diocese was discovered to be a molester, and there was quite it was one of the most disgusting cases as far as there was a paper trail where he was asking collaborators in his crimes to come up with the most vulnerable boys.
Oh, yeah.
Even telling them how to pick out the most vulnerable boys. And, I don't think that I think that was a lot of wasted time and effort by that John Jay Commission. But I don't think anyone's actually come up with a great solution for this crisis yet. I mean, I just haven't been. I haven't liked any of the answers. I think it's slowly. The statistics are that abuse is going down, but I don't think that has anything other to do than that there was a generation of priests that are now in their 60s and 70s, maybe going off into retirement, who were the generation that mainly was responsible for this crisis.
Yeah, it could have a lot of causes, and it might have something to do with the declining number of people that are going into the priesthood. I think that's probably the number one cause. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there used to be, in the heyday, at least in American Catholicism in the 40s and 50s, when you had lots of men during the priesthood, there were lots of men who were screened out, frankly, and they were given psychological tests and so on, and now that's not the case. But anyway, I actually would recommend anyone to read your piece. I thought it was really good.
I also would recommend Frances Kissling's, because she talks a little bit more about it from a being a Catholic point of view.
Right.
And she actually has substantial recommendations as to stop the abuse. The number one being they need to quit punishing priests, or stop having such a punishing attitude towards priests. Like, there's a tendency to try and get priests away from the community they grew up in or community they've grown attached to. And I think that kind of divides them from the community in a way that reduces their accountability. And I thought that was a really good point.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. I mean, I mentioned the heyday of American Catholicism. There used to be a culture where priests would grow up in a parish, they would study in that diocese, maybe do a couple years in Rome, then come back to the same neighborhoods that they were in, maybe not the same exact parish they grew up in, but they were close to a large family, close to a lot of other social connections. But in a strange way, priests have become the most atomized individuals in the world. I mean, they're shuffled around. I mean, conservatives often complain of rootlessness, but there's no one more rootless now than a diocesan parish priest.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was another thing I wanted to talk about on the religion front. There was an article I saw Andrew Sullivan linked to on the Smart Set, which is, I think, a publication from Drexel. Mm-hmm. And there was a student, Jessica Crispin, arguing, in a sense, for the immutability or the persistence of magical belief or the persistence of religious belief, despite the Enlightenment, which is now growing a couple hundred years old now. And I was wondering what you had to say about this. I had a few thoughts myself, but what do you make of the difference between organized belief or these kind of magical beliefs or personal spiritualities that seem persistent and growing?
Well, my feeling is religious belief is socially based. Okay. I think superstition is a little bit different in a lot of ways. I think they're related. I think that our brain does mental tricks on us that causes us to see things that aren't there, and that religion kind of grows out of that. But if it wasn't for social structures that encourage religion, I don't think it would ever get past superstition. It would never get past the, crossing your fingers while you're at the crafts table kind of thinking.
Right.
Because there's just superstitions don't tend to grow beyond what their immediate need is. And I think that, praying to some kind of ancestor or some kind of, supernatural being would never get past that if it wasn't for the social need for religion. So I find the spirituality thing kind of an interesting growth, and I think it is just like organized religion about your social stature, your place in a community. I think a lot of people don't want to be part of organized religion for a lot of the reasons, like, for instance, sex abuse scandals.
Right, yeah.
But they also don't want to be perceived as atheists. and they choose to be spiritual, and that allows them to have it both ways. And I think that's silly. I find as an atheist that the notion that we're socially ostracized is a little strange. Of course, I live in New York City, but I didn't always.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I see, even Sam Harris sometimes has gotten flack for promoting meditation.
From me, no less.
Right. I actually gave him some flack, too, once for it. But I remember an atheist conference that I was covering and poking a little fun at, where he brought it up, and it was pretty controversial. And I think even Daniel Dennett mentioned doing some kind of meditation based on, I guess, the Brook Farm style. Now,
most atheists just, drink or something.
Right.
Exercise.
Well, Catholics do that.
I know, but I mean, instead of meditation or do it as a spiritual thing, you can get the same effects in different ways.
Right. What I think is interesting is this growth of spirituality apart from religion. I think of, the difference between organized religion and what I would call disorganized religion. And
that's a great term.
I think we had a great recent example of disorganized religion in the Rapture believers. That story seems like years old now, but it's only a week old. We're only a week past the apocalypse. And Harold Camping was preaching for 20 years for Christians to leave church, to leave that behind, and that churches were corrupt, that the age of the church had ended, and sort of you had to... it was kind of a hyper-Protestantism. It was a Bible alone without a church or without a community. And I feel like that is exactly what leads to this kind of apocalyptic fervor, or, that's what allows, in a sense, those magical beliefs or superstition to really gather intensity. Whereas you don't find, the Catholic Church has never tried to call a date and say this is the date it's all ending, or the Missouri Synod Lutherans, or something like that.
Because they're institutional, they have an interest in perpetuating themselves in a way that maybe non-attached people don't. Yeah, no,
but I think it's a good argument because, I felt like Harold Camping was a great argument for organized religion. People had spent their life savings. People had, people with children who had ambitions of their own of being educated, suddenly found themselves bankrupt because of these visions.
Yeah.
And, these apocalyptic visions always happen in cult-like settings, where the Branch Davidians or the Hale-Bops.
But see, I think that might be evidence against the contention that it's about organized versus disorganized religion, because say what you will, the Branch Davidians are an organized church.
Right.
They always were. They're still around.
Oh, I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, they're still in Waco. They have a church. They've kind of, now that they don't have David Koresh around anymore, they're a lot more moderate in their beliefs, but they also have a victim mentality that I think is reasonable considering their circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. But, if you don't have larger structures, you become more susceptible to one charismatic leader who then can impose control through even charm, or impose systems of control through just the force of personality. So I don't know. I think we're in an interesting time in this debate between organized and disorganized religion, where they both seem, I suppose, to be falling apart.
I kind of have I don't know if it's in conflict with your theory. I have a sort of alternate theory as to why we're seeing a lot more apocalyptic beliefs lately. And I agree that Protestantism has something to do with that. The fact that you can just spin off on your own church whenever you want. I also think that it's because we are the Enlightenment's been around for a few hundred years, but it's only been for about, I'd say, less than 100 years that science has mattered to ordinary Americans, especially, and maybe ordinary people around the world. In some places, even less time than that. You know,
Right.
The 1920s was probably the first time that there was a real battle over the theory of evolution on a populist level. I don't think that most people until the past few decades have ever had their belief in God challenged in a substantive way. And I think that what we're seeing is your average believer nowadays has to deal with the fact that there is a counter theory to God, that we evolved, that there is no God, that this is just chance. And apocalyptic thinking is an extreme reaction to that at a certain level. I think it's because there's a tension there, and it feels emotionally like it must resolve itself. And for a believer, it's very easy, I think, to take the next step and think, then, therefore, we're at the end days. It's not logical,
Right.
it's emotional, but I think that's kind of why we're seeing more of it.
Well, do you think, it's interesting you say that it's the first time a lot of people have had their beliefs challenged in this way. But I don't think on the popular level, a lot of people are reading, popular science books by Brian Greene, and suddenly their former religious worldview falls apart. I feel like the battle is much...
I think most people, this is the first time in history that they've been aware that atheism exists.
Maybe. I mean, it's always been kind of talked about in theory.
For most people, I'm skeptical. I really am. I don't think that it's been an idea that's been around. I mean, it's always been a philosophical concept since the beginning of
Right.
time, basically. If you are a scholar and a philosopher, you're going to come across that concept by yourself.
Right.
I don't think your average person, most people turn to religion to get answers, not because of any other, and that's the emotional need that they have in it. And now that they're aware there are other answers, they may not understand those answers, they may not engage with those answers, but they do know that they exist. And I don't think that prior to the 20th century that was true.
I think that's true. I think the emotional tension, though, you're talking about isn't born of a psychological conflict or a worry that maybe my set of answers are insufficient. I think most people are reacting on the level of stigma and shame or fear. I mean, I don't think the average believer, picks up a book by an atheist and reads through it and considers whether this really has changed their ideas or not. And I don't think the average atheist picks up the Summa Theologica and looks up, Thomas Aquinas's, arguments for God, 5 arguments from natural, what he calls, or what we now call natural theology. I don't think anyone does that. I think on a lot of level this begins as an intuition, and then it works itself out in the social sphere through stigma, through the praising of certain beliefs and the hating of others. I mean, most people are in the mushy middle, and that's sort of where social approval is. You can be religious, but don't be so extreme, or you can be agnostic, but don't be an atheist and expect a ton of respect.
And thus the spirituality compromise.
Yeah, actually that's a great way of putting it. It's funny, though, the way those words change, because a lot of people in, say, the 1950s, the word spiritual was very popular, and religious wasn't at all.
Mm-hmm.
There was already, at least among upper classes already, and now it's become much more popular to say spiritual and not religious. Well, anyway, let's transition here. There was a lot of things going on. We mentioned in emails before we did this about the interplay of sex and power in our public life with Arnold and Dominique Strauss-Kahn. And, of course, the reactions have been amazing. And I guess if we start on Dominique Strauss-Kahn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, or one takeaway that maybe, one thing that you could offer that maybe we haven't heard elsewhere.
I think you're right. I think the most interesting thing about it has been the reactions. And, I agree with you. I feel like the dialogue around because, these kind of crises crop up regularly in our culture, where powerful men either exploit or openly abuse women. and it creates a cultural crisis. And to the point that I think we're kind of constantly in crisis about it, which is why I think that I've been fascinated by the reactions in our country to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, because even though he's a popular figure in a lot of ways, even in our country, the reaction has been largely what I, as a long-time anti-rape advocate, I guess that's how I'd put it, have wanted so badly, is people to, like, get angry. People have gotten angry at him, and I'm really thrilled with that, because I'm usually angry with with men that are put in this situation where they've probably done something really wrong, but they get away with it, which he's not getting away with it, and I'm genuinely thrilled with that. I'm not just thrilled that the justice system is taking this seriously. I'm thrilled to see, on every cable news show I've seen it talked about, every comedy show, even Saturday Night Live took this seriously. Like, I mean, they made fun of it, but, the level of the accusation wielded against him is being taken seriously, and I can't account for why that is, but I am thrilled.
No, it is amazing, and it has all the ingredients, right? It has, a minority, working class woman pointing the finger at, even though he's a member of the Socialist Party, he is an elite figure. I mean, you can't get more elite, really.
I mean, how rich do you think he is? It seems like...
Head of the iron.
Are they billionaires?
Well, that's exactly right. Especially if his wife bailed him out, and it was, to get him under, essentially house arrest now, which was really quite expensive. But it has been great. And it's been great also. There's been a funny, although this sometimes makes me uncomfortable, but there's been a funny kind of nationalistic undertow to it as well, with, people were proud that the NYPD got on this plane, dragged out this, lascivious French man, that he's been photographed embarrassingly. The reaction to Bernard Henry Levy's sort of horrifying defense of his friend, which is sort of like, we are of a class that just cannot be accused of these things.
The old European class attitudes really kind of came out. In a way, I'm kind of glad, though, that they talk about it so openly, because Americans are just like that. We just don't say it like they do. When a rich man in our culture is accused of sexual assault, we just do what Ben Stein did, which is like, no.
That's right. I mean, it even happened with, a few years ago with Kobe Bryant. The similar thing, a hotel, and then immediately it was, it's amazing how people immediately, absent any facts, just concoct narratives and stories for themselves about what must have took place or what must have happened. And usually they run in a direction that you could fairly describe as counter-feminist. But in this one instance, it was not. It was taken very seriously. I was wondering, though, it brings up another issue, which I think our culture has a very hard time now because we have assimilated a lot of feminist critiques. We always use the phrase consenting adults to legitimize some kind of sexual act. But what's interesting is that I think people, maybe especially Europeans or French in particular, there are other things besides consent that go into sex. I mean, there might be seduction, there might be, I might say temptation or other things that don't fit in.
I think those are rationalizations for a widespread cultural tolerance of abusive attitudes towards women. And I love the French, don't get me wrong.
Right.
I mean, I'm half French, which actually caused some confusion after the Strauss-Kahn case, and I got some media calls, and they were like, what, you're not French? A lot of French women are just have this put-upon attitude that I feel like if you, like, a lot of Americans look to French culture and they look at people making excuses for it. If you look at the criticisms of the culture coming from the culture, I think you get a much different picture of what, their attitudes about consent are. The French have been behind Americans on feminist issues since roughly forever. Like, Simone de Beauvoir complained about it in The Second Sex. She said that she complained that in the 1940s, that there was a law then about women not being allowed to wear pants, and you would get fined for it if you wore pants in public.
Right.
And she's like, the American women, they wear pants all the time. Like, what's the problem?
Right. I mean, well, but I absolutely grant that. But I'm wondering, though, I guess on the deeper level or on a personal level, where is there room for ideas of seduction? Not in this case at all. This, clearly is a woman is accusing a man of rape, and our justice system is taking that seriously. But this idea of consent, I think, raises problems for ideas of seduction or temptation, or people who, if you trace their idea of consent, they maybe, I don't know, at the beginning of an evening did not consent or would not have imagined where the end of the evening takes them. And there's sort of, the romance of sexual attraction, or at least what we tell ourselves about romance, it doesn't track neatly with consent the way we use it to legitimize acts. I'm not saying that people who are seduced don't eventually consent, but the whole idea of seduction is to create consent.
I don't think that it's that confusing. I mean, I've done a lot of work in this, and the fact of the matter is, it's not really all that confusing. Like your average rapist, or coercive whatever, they get off on the fact that you're not into it. I don't.
Oh, right. I'm actually trying to divorce this from the conversation about rape.
Yeah, okay.
I just mean sex in general.
I think there's a black and white line. And I mean, whether or not you talk somebody into it, if they're saying yes, 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 then go for it. Like, people change their minds about all sorts of things, In fact, I think part of the problem is that we focus more on the seducers, like selling points or whatever, and maybe a little less on the seducees' impulsivity. Like, I mean, if you are an impulsive person, you're probably easier to seduce,
Right.
Thus, I think, obviously, the question is autonomy and whether or not people have it. And I don't think, to me, it's not. There's just no gray there. I mean, I think most people date with an open mind and to possibility. That's kind of the point of dating.
Right.
I don't think that there's ever been the notion that feminists want you to have some kind of written contract before, we're going to do X, Y, and Z is more of a right-wing myth about what feminists are asking than a reality. And in fact, I think a lot of feminist discourse around consent is based on the assumption that seduction happens. I forget what college it was. Back in the 90s, there was some scandal about how they wanted you to affirmatively consent to every act. And I was like, well, but already built into there is the assumption that it's a process and not either you sit down and go, we're going to have this kind of sex or that. It's like you're kissing and then maybe you want to go further. At that point, you should probably ask.
Right. No, but people really do talk about this stuff when they sit down with friends. And I do think that there is male uncertainty, at least if you're trying to be, and this is going to sound so patriarchal, but I guess if you're trying to be a gentleman in the new age that we live in, about how to negotiate these, and that's the term that comes up, negotiate. How do you...
Asking is sexy. I have never understood that. I mean,
Right, but a lot of men don't believe that now. A lot of men, it's very weird because the reaction to this, which I don't think necessarily is right or left wing, but there's a male reaction that I hear that of just going for it and just doing it, and that's what will enthrall a woman.
I think there's a lot of cultural propaganda that suggests that. I agree, like romantic comedies.
Yeah.
Make it seem like being forceful with somebody is romantic instead of scary. I don't think that women. I've asked a lot of women in my time if they think asking is not sexy, and I've never heard no. I mean, that's just anecdotal, but
I guess it's true. But and just anecdotally, I seem to read a lot of stuff. When Slate is having their TV reviews of Mad Men, where they have like 75 people writing in every week about what they thought of the latest episode, and they do seem to romanticize, a Don Draper figure who seduces women and sometimes is quite forceful about it.
Is he though? One of the reasons his character is so conflicting is that he is a pig to his wife, but when he's trying to get somebody in bed, he's usually very solicitous to them, don't you think?
I think sometimes, but he also uses it as a weapon, right? I mean, he uses, I forget, when he's dealing with the agent, she's a bit of the older woman, I think in the first or second season, and they're in a restaurant, and he pins her against a wall. I mean, what was interesting about that is extremely forceful, and I think would make any feminist really uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable to watch.
It made me uncomfortable. Yeah.
Right, but the
of course that was situated in a specific character. I mean. Right,
but I mean, if you just describe the bare bones of that scene, which is that there was a business negotiation undercurrent, and then suddenly a man pins a woman against the wall, performs a sexual act that she didn't ask for, and then all of a sudden she relents or she gives into that and then gives into him. I mean, just describing that, divorce it from the great sets and costumes and what you know previously of this woman and this man, that sounds awful, but yet it's given rave reviews and even treated as a kind of realism.
I would, at this point, distinguish between fantasy and reality, and I think that's something a lot of people need to think about. Like, a lot of women's fantasies are based around non-consent sexual fantasies, or like less than consent or forceful seduction or whatever. I mean, certainly romance novels forever and ever were all like the first sex act in a traditional Harlequin romance novel is a rape. I mean, straight up.
Right.
Part of that is because women have been, and that's fading, and it's not under feminist pressure, actually. I think it's fading because the cultural context of that has changed significantly, which is women's sexuality has always been shamed, and sexual desires have always been shamed. And so what a rape fantasy gets you is you get to have the sex, and it's not your fault. I think that can eroticize it in fantasy, but because somebody fantasizes about something doesn't in any way, shape, or form mean that they think it's hot in real life. And to take it away from sex and to a different kind of fantasy, I think a lot of people have fantasies of confrontation, of violence. A lot of us just imagine walking up to somebody, just socking them in the face because they make us angry. If we were presented with the actual opportunity to do that, I think many of us would balk, not because of social conventions, but because we legitimately do not enjoy doing violence on each other. And I think that it's similar in real life with rape fantasies. And I think a lot of people watch that, and you can't divorce it from the context. That woman was a relentless bitch. John Hamm is incredibly sexy. It's the 1960s, so they've already got a pre-existing kind of relationship with some BDSM play involved. I mean, the fantasy is safe. If you did that to a woman in real life, I don't think as many would think that was fun at all as the watch out on TV and we're like, oh, that's so hot.
Right, and I have no anecdotal evidence to contradict you. Well, let's move on to another one. I mean, there was another story having to do with this was Arnold Schwarzenegger, and obviously Maria Shriver is said now to be filing for divorce from him. There have been stories about Arnold for years being a pig. Mm-hmm. Right? I actually clearly remember a story. There was a story in Premiere Magazine in 2001, which
when he was still just a movie star.
Right. It was right when his movie star. I think the hook of the story was, well, his last films aren't doing so great, and now that they're not, these stories are starting to come out. And the writer detailed, I think, 5 or 6 different accusations with really salacious quotes, like "eating is not cheating," which add the weird Austrian accent to, and it becomes even more horrifying.
It's sort of like cheesy, like Yuckster personality.
Absolutely. But these, again, were submerged. He became governor. These accusations didn't hurt his campaign, which I thought they would. I think the reason is that for what Dominique Strauss-Kahn is not getting, which is Schwarzenegger has so many friends and so many high-profile defenders. I mean, even Emma Thompson defended him. Right. Well, and even there's also the element of he has so many people he paid to defend him from these exact charges. You know, there are PR firms. I'm sure his agency, also does some work in this regard of browbeating reporters. But
and of course his wife.
Right. Well, what did you make though of this? Because I'm curious. I mean, I don't know your views on marriage per se, but what did you make of this arrangement where he had a relationship with household staff, she had a child, he has given some kind of monetary support? I mean, what do you make of it? I mean, did he...
Well, if Maria Shriver had been in on it, then I don't know how much of it's our business, but it's obvious that, to me, it's obvious that this was as much a surprise to her as anybody else. My personal theory, and this is just based on the public group evidence and reaction, is that the story the Schwarzeneggers have told about it is true. I think that they're telling the truth, that he waited till his governorship was over, then he told her. I would, if I was her, that would be the worst kind of betrayal, not only that he did it, but also because he was clearly using me the whole time as cover while he was a politician, and now that I'm useless to him for that, he doesn't care what I think of him anymore. That really was kind of sad to me. I don't know if this has anything to do with my feelings on marriage. It just strikes me as of the worst sort of personal betrayal.
Yeah, it's interesting because Maria, supposedly even as back as far as 2001 with this Maria, with this article I talked about in Premiere Magazine, I think the author mentioned that he'd spent a little time with Arnold, and then the next morning was in an elevator with the 3 of them, and suddenly he said that he perceived in Maria this sense of shame, wifely shame, like, now you know that my husband is cheating on me. Mm-hmm. And as a personal drama, I think bearing that kind of shame and secret is unbelievably damaging to a person and tragic and very sad. Part of the reason I think for taking marriage vows is you make your relationship public, and the expectations for it, in a way, become public. And one of the reasons to do that is precisely so that a husband or wife could call back their spouse in a sort of public way and say, you are acting wrong, you're dishonoring this relationship, which has been sanctioned, by our faith, by the public, etc. And to give that up is, in a sense, to give up the whole marriage itself, and to make it a prison for herself. So, on one level, I just want to react to it personally, but, is there any redemption for him for now going public, or is that purely just the cynical move of someone who's out of public life, would like to be done with this marriage?
My gut feeling is cynical. I get the impression off of him that he's just an exploitive person, that his charm is completely glib, that, and the fact that, to my mind, it's the cheating is whatever. I mean, that's terrible, but like what alarms me far more is that he has this long history of women accusing him of sexually abusing them. So to my mind, the way that that's connected is that, a cheater can often be just somebody who gets off on feeling wanted, or they have personal issues or whatever. Abusers tend to be kind of a little bit meaner, a little more soulless, I think that he just strikes me as a user in the worst possible way. And it's hard for me to even get past that. I mean, Shriver probably had a long suspicion that her husband wasn't, like, a good guy, but she stood by him because of whatever reason. And I mean...
It's like a Kennedy thing, right? It's like a Kennedy woman thing.
Yeah, she may not have been raised in a way that we don't know that. I mean, her father and mother are like one of the few Kennedy couples that have a good relationship.
Right.
But I, as far as the marriage situation, I mean, I think that marriage is falling apart as far as a public accountability thing. I think any couple that's long-standing tends to create the same reputation that a married couple does. I can even tell you if half the friends I have that are couples are married or not. Like, I mean, so-called, I think marriage is a legal phenomenon and a civic phenomenon more than it is a cultural phenomenon now, because we have kind of gradually as a culture for, I think the better, have just sort of created a situation where people can have long-standing relationships that are understood socially as just that. And it's nice because it's personalized. It can be whatever you need it to be. And people are remarkably adept at grasping the nuances of somebody else's relationship. So, for instance, I feel like that, Strauss-Kahn and his wife, for instance, kind of have a famously open marriage.
Right.
And people, if it wasn't for the accusations of violence against women, I don't think I have a problem with that. Like, as long as everybody in your community is cool with it, I don't have a problem with it,
Right. It's funny. I don't know if I even... It depends what kind of a problem would I have with it, right? I mean, I think it's morally wrong. Does that mean I think that the state should get involved? I don't think so, no. Does it mean that the community could stigmatize it? I think that's up to the community itself, right? I mean, I don't think... It's funny, I think... Actually, you hit upon a great distinction there of marriage becoming more of a legal phenomenon over time. I think the cultural phenomenon has waned and maybe was unsustainable because the cultural legal mix was a function of having a much more... a compromise between having a country that had Catholics, Protestants, and Jews be the vast majority of people, and just kind of cobbling together a legal regime that changed slowly but accommodated those three views of marriage. And eventually I think most people don't even turn to their religion exclusively to define the relationship that they call their marriage.
Yeah, I mean, and on top of that, I mean, not only do they not, but how many marriages are just simply civil marriages? I think... in the past 10 years of my life, I have gone to a million weddings, seriously, and I think 3 have been in a church.
Right.
And then I've been to weddings that were performed by ministers, but they were not irreligious weddings. Like, I went to one where They did an American irreligious ceremony, and then they did a Persian irreligious ceremony to reflect the cultural backgrounds of the people involved. And but it was a Baptist minister who did it, but only because he could marry them and he was family.
Yeah, there's lots of that, and there's lots of that too, and there's also lots of informally, superficially religious marriages, right? So it's literally, and I don't mean this to be demeaning, but it's literally the woman wants it to be in a church. That's just the setting they've imagined.
Or if their friend is a minister, and he's like, I have a church, sure.
Yeah, they're not members of a church. They're not, they're not going to go to the church's, own kind of marriage courts or whatever if they want to dissolve the marriage. And but but this shift took time, and now it's really fallen apart, and it shows, I guess, it's why conservatives, I think, Connor Friedersdorf has argued that, look, for the vast majority of Americans, marriage is a kind of set of legal responsibilities and privileges.
And an opportunity to have a wedding. Let's not forget this.
Right. See, I like I like your view here. I think that's very practical and human.
I'm serious. Almost everybody I know gets married anymore because they finally realize that they want the wedding.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, when you ask people just sort of casually, why now? Why get married now? They go, well, we thought it would be fun to have a wedding.
But isn't there also something implicit in that I think there still is something implicit in that, though, the potential maybe for children, maybe not immediately, but sometime down the line.
Yeah.
And giving some kind of...
That's the other half of weddings I know. I got pregnant.
Right. Well, no, but I mean, those reflect real human desires for creating that kind of obligation.
Yeah, no, and also
because once
there's the legal ramifications of a legal civil marriage press upon you much more when you have a child in the picture, because now I think the feeling that you have, and it's probably financial more than anything. When you are just two individuals, if you break up, you can separate your finances usually fairly quickly and very simply. And if you have anything combined, you can do it just off the books. You don't have to get lawyers and crap involved. But if there's a child, they have interests, material interests that need to be protected. And I don't know if people know specifically what they're thinking about. They just know that maybe right now the marriage is a good idea. It offers more legal protection for the child.
Do you think that that's a situation that should remain, this kind of muddled... do you like this kind of cultural and legal situation we're in now, in general?
I think that I don't even know how much I would feel like I could predict where it's going to change. I think our culture has shifted to accommodate a lot of social changes that are positive, and it's probably going to continue to shift, and it's going to probably go in ways that are hard to anticipate. I'm not big on the illusion of control. I think, big changes are the result of a lot of people making choices that make perfect sense to them. And since I can't second guess anybody's personal choices in most cases, you go, well, maybe I could, but in most cases I think people kind of do what works best for them. I think they're the best judge of their own life. And it creates these big social shifts. So that's a long way of saying yes, I'm fine with the way things are, because everybody I know who gets married, pretty much 9 times out of 10, I feel like, well, they did what's best for them. And then those of us, like myself, who just kind of live idly in sin forever and ever and ever, we're also doing what's best for ourselves,
Yeah, it's funny in a way. This sort of libertarian attitude, almost, or this live and let live attitude, allowed me, I think, culturally to do something that looks quite traditional and looks almost so traditional it's countercultural, in a way that maybe previously wasn't possible, or in a way that previously would have been more difficult. So in weddings now, there's just such a fetish for choices and for a multiplication of choices because it's a gigantic consumer event.
Yeah, and it's entertainment, and I don't have a problem with that either because
neither do I.
It's entertainment for your friends, and as much as people's weddings are different, are as good as you're going to get.
Right, but it's interesting because on the one hand, there's a tension in my view where, as a Catholic, I believe in receiving this as a tradition, right? We receive the tradition, but I did not want the post-Vatican II Mass for my nuptial Mass. But because...
Did you have a nuptial Mass at all?
Yeah, we did. We had the traditional Latin nuptial Mass when I was married a couple years ago. And that's only, in a way, only thinkable right now because we have such a multiplicity of choices.
How did the priest react when you asked for that?
Well, the thing is, we had to go around. I couldn't just go to, 50 years ago in a Catholic America that I kind of idealized, you were just given the Mass that the church would give you, that your local parish would give you. And I like that idea of just receiving it, but now that the old Mass is not known by most priests, we had to go out of our way, find a priest, find a chapel that could accommodate it, and turn it into our own. In a way, it was kind of like a shopping or customization experience in itself to try to recreate a tradition that was not actually handed down to us.
Yeah.
In a way that the church had abandoned that tradition, and so we had to recreate it. And the only way we could do it is with these freedoms to do whatever we want.
That point you make, I also think indicates one other reason I think that wedding traditions have changed so dramatically towards being a choice-oriented thing. A lot more people are marrying outside of their familial culture. I mean,
right.
We're just a much more multicultural society, and almost nobody who gets married anymore goes to the same church, or not as many.
Right.
And often couples that do end up going to the same church choose it together after they marry. So, I mean...
No, it's funny, too. And also, there's a funny thing. One of the things we found out when we were looking at doing a traditional Latin nuptial Mass was that even there were big cultural differences. So one of the chapels locally to us that did the traditional Mass, it was a member of the Society of St. Pius X, had a priest from South America. So, and this was in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So these Ridgefield, Connecticut hardcore traditional Catholics would suddenly have forced on them all of these Mexican wedding traditions.
Yeah.
That precede the ceremony or post-ceremony that the priest wanted to impose on them. And so even in that, and which was great in a way, because
they're
it's just great to have.
Yeah.
Well, if they're great traditions, it's also great to have Connecticuters have to express themselves in a more Latin way, Latin American way. But it's funny in a way. By doing this, in a weird way, by having this freedom, people took the statement we were making more seriously. Because it was like, okay, they've gone through a lot of trouble to make this kind of coherent statement about what their marriage is, what their expectations are. And so people took that quite seriously in a way that if it was just handed down to us and just de rigueur, they would have been nonplussed. So, and it's just something I wrestle with because I like to create the stigmas in society where this is handed down.
And yet you benefit from that not being true.
Exactly.
See, that's my argument for no stigmas. we all win. Like I'm very much a pragmatic humanist in this way. I think everybody should be able to maximize their own, happiness in life, and that's the way to do it. Is just maximum freedom.
Well, I guess I wish more were like you then. Because I think stigma is still a big part of how people behave.
I don't disagree. I just only think the things that should be stigmatized are things that are legitimately harmful. Like here we are talking about weddings and the diversity of them, and it's a net gain. It's a net benefit, or a benefit to not having weddings. I have never been married, and I am much better off for it. Why take that from me?
I don't know. I think the compelling argument for society making this more explicit definitionally is to be able to call people back from what they would view as abusive situations or bad situations, whether it's self-abusive or abusive to another person.
Maybe, but I mean, if I'm in a bad relationship, I can turn around and walk out much more easily than if I was married. Much more easily. In fact, I know this. I've terminated a long-standing relationship before.
Right.
Didn't have to divorce the guy. That was nice.
Right, but I mean, maybe there were no children involved in that. But maybe if there are, if you have a situation where most people still get married, most long-standing couples still do choose to have at least one child or more, and then that creates, like you said, a series of material interests or whatever.
And people usually react to that by getting married, like you said. So I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's like, when you give people choices, they are surprisingly good at making the correct ones. They may not follow tradition, but to me, my mind, that says that maybe traditions were wrong.
Maybe. I think you have a much higher, it's funny, you've always said you're so cynical, but I think I'm more cynical about the choices people make, and sort of the lack of thought that goes into them. I think there's just so much, even on these big life choices, there's so much is left to intuition. Perhaps I should give up the hope for fully engaged logicians, acting throughout all their lives.
People can only make a completely rational choice with 100% of information available to them, and it is physically impossible to have full information about relationship choices. You can know a lot about a person, but you're not going to know how they change. You don't know how the relationship will change them. You don't know how circumstances are going to change. You don't know that the economy is going to tank and they're going to lose their job. You don't know.
Right.
And so I think people make not everybody, not all the time, but a surprising percentage of people make better decisions than you would think if you had a low opinion of kind of just human intelligence,
Right, but I think, it's funny you say you can't have all that information, but that's precisely what's hidden in the traditional wedding vows, right? For richer, for poorer, for, in sickness and in health.
Yeah, but then your question is, when things turn ugly, are people better off? I don't think that that's true. Particularly women are not better off in trapped situations.
Right, but they're also not better off if, say, I've always said the ultimate test would be, the day after your wedding day, one person in the couple gets hit by a bus and is suddenly incapacitated for the next, 3 or 4 decades. I mean, in a way, the wedding vow, what I think creates the romance of those traditional vows is this promise to love, even in tough or desperate circumstances. That are out of your control. And those are precisely those things that are mentioned in the wedding vows, sickness and in health, richer or poor. I
think you may over-romanticize how much people stuck by their spouses in the past.
Well, they don't. No,
they just cut out of town.
Right, but that's something I would condemn, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not... And that's something that goes against the vow that you kind of...
But now...
We kind of publicly make them
now
take.
That there's more of a public acceptance of terminating a relationship that's not working out, it's often easier to arrange for the person who's being left to not just be cast aside. So, if you can get a divorce now, for instance, a lot of women in the past, men would just leave them. No support, no job, no children, no support for their children, no alimony, no legal divorce so that they could get married again. Nothing. Now women have all of those things. And, getting hit by a bus, that does happen much more often as relationships kind of fall apart by their own accord. And I think that our pro-divorce culture allows both people to walk away with something in their pocket.
Right, but it also gives people, it gives people something in their pocket, right? But it also gives ready-made excuses for people who are just abandoning, maybe they're abandoning a woman who became sick and they think, I just don't want to deal with 5 years of chemotherapy, or I don't want to deal with, having to live with someone who's dying for the next 10 or 15 years. So then I just abandon them, I leave the most emotionally important, I take away the most emotionally important relationship in their life, and I can just say, oh, well, it wasn't working out for me.
See, I don't see that happening much. Maybe it does, and I don't. Most couples I know, well, first of all, most of the time when one of you gets sick, you've been together for a long time. And
right.
I've never known anybody who broke up when somebody got sick. I mean, I've seen maybe the far extreme of that is somebody got in, like, they changed their personality so much because of an illness that the marriage eventually fell apart. But usually it was after a long time. And then at that point, like I said, because of our cultural support for divorce, the sick person was able to be moved into relationships that worked better for them anyway.
But it's also precisely, though, why we are able to, why the story of Newt Gingrich divorcing his wife on, her sickbed was so powerful.
Yeah, well, he's a bad guy. I don't think bad guys like that have ever stood by their wives when they were ill.
Right, but I mean, isn't it the cultural residue of those vows that, it was doubly offensive?
I don't think that the marriage vows create the human belief in love and support and cultural support. Like, for instance, a lot of people stand by their friends. We don't have a legal relationship to our friends, but we don't abandon them when they're ill either,
Although a lot of people do, I mean, a lot of people, they say, I mean, it's a joking thing among, at least I remember among Italian Americans in New Jersey that, well, only families are going to show up at your funeral, only family, even the people you fought with will show up, but even your friends, as you get sick, they just sort of drop off, and, maybe you have one or two friends, but your entire family will be there. So.
I mean, I don't think, I think it depends on, I think what you're saying, I just disagree that the traditions create family or close relationships. I think people's need for that exists. We create cultural constraints that allow for that to happen, and they adapt to and giving people the freedom to adapt those cultural constraints to their needs creates, in my experience, much stronger, more sustainable relationships where you get more out of it, which I think is more important than anything, where everybody involved gets more out of it. Whereas I don't necessarily think just creating an arbitrary tradition with legal constraints on it does much at all.
Right. Well, I would just say, and maybe this will be the one of the final shots, is that those traditions can give meaning to situations we find ourselves in that we may feel stuck with, and we may have made these choices anyway. And those traditions invest those personal choices with a deeper meaning and significance than they would be if they were just the results of our own choice, right? So it becomes not just what I did because it worked out, but it's virtuous, it's in a long line of virtue, it's, it's praiseworthy as it's always been praiseworthy, and that, I think that helps people make difficult decisions. It helps people stick it out when life gets tough. They just rely on the strength of the tradition, even when the strength of their own personal agency wouldn't give them enough.
I can see that. I just generally think that morals exist even without traditions to compel them. And I think people can we don't need to say, like, I do this because it's traditional. We can say, I do this because it's right.
Right.
And I think that's not a problem.
Right. I guess I would see it in both sides. Is that it's right, and then the tradition helps embody it and helps make it real. I mean, when you talk about tradition, nothing sounds more airy than tradition in the abstract. You know, I mean that's why it's so easy to dismiss in the abstract. But when you have everything from statues to stories being repeated.
Well, that's never going to go away. That's just culture.
Right.
The question is whether or not it's, when you invoke the word tradition, then it incurs certain kinds of obligations that may not be adaptable to the people that are using them. So I think I tend to just lean more on culture is good, tradition not so much. Culture can change,
right. Well,
tradition by definition shouldn't.
Yeah, traditions are supposed to evolve. I think the thing is, conservatives latched onto the word tradition once they felt liberals began to own the word culture. Mm-hmm. And originally, in the Middle Ages, there was no difference in a lot of ways.
No, I think things are breaking apart and becoming more nuanced and specific. But I think we should probably this is a great discussion, but we don't want to drag this out.
Right, no, it's great. It might seem pretty abstract, but this has been great. Yeah. And I'm glad we could do this. And I don't know when this will air, but I hope you enjoy the rest of Memorial Day.
You too. Thanks.
All right,
Bye.
Take care. Bye.